The cruelest way to break a woman's heart is not to leave her alone, but to make her stand in a crowded room and watch herself be replaced. Audrey Ellison learned this beneath the crystal chandeliers of Silverpine Hall, where 500 candles trembled in their silver sconces and the winter sea beat against the cliffs of Cape Wren nearly 200 feet below. The mansion rose above the Atlantic like a pale ghost of old New England wealth, all white-gray stone, black shutters, and long windows filled with golden firelight. Carriages lined the frozen drive for nearly a quarter-mile, their lanterns glowing through the mist, while footmen carried cloaks dusted with salt and snow into the marble entrance hall. Inside, the Belmont Winter Assembly had already begun to glitter with silk, pearls, polished shoes, and careful cruelty. Audrey stood near the eastern staircase in a gown the color of warm ivory, altered from one her mother had worn before the Ellison name began its quiet fall. The hem had been mended so skillfully no one would notice unless they wished to be unkind, and in rooms like this, many people wished exactly that. Around her wrist was a narrow ribbon of pale blue silk, tied in a simple bow. Grant Caldwell, Duke of Belmont, had given it to her 3 weeks earlier after a charity concert at St. Orla's Assembly Room, when the rain had trapped them beneath the same stone archway, and he had spoken to her not as a duke speaks to a poor young lady, but as a lonely man speaks to the only person in the world who has not asked him for anything. He had said the color suited her. He had said, very softly, that he hoped she would wear it at Silverpine. And then, with that controlled gravity that made every woman in Cape Wren lower her voice when he passed, he had promised her the first waltz. Audrey had not told anyone. Hope, in a house with unpaid bills and a mother who coughed through the night, was too precious to display before witnesses. So she had carried the promise silently, folded inside her chest like a letter pressed between Bible pages. When the orchestra lifted their bows and the first notes drifted across the ballroom, she looked toward the tall doors with the calm face she had practiced since childhood. Grant entered in black evening dress, his silver pocket watch chain catching the candlelight, his dark blonde hair brushed back from a face too stern to be called handsome in any easy way. He looked carved rather than born, made of duty, winter, and old money. For one breath, his gray eyes found Audrey across the room. She felt the look before she understood it, a small tightening beneath her ribs. Then Miss Helena Voss stepped beside him in a gown of champagne satin, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. Helena was the daughter of the wealthiest banking family on the coast, with diamonds at her throat and confidence in every angle of her chin. Grant did not smile at her. That almost made it worse. He did not look like a man enchanted. He looked like a man making a decision. The floor opened. Couples waited. Audrey's dance card hung from her wrist, blank except for the first line, where she had written nothing because his promise had needed no ink. Grant walked forward. The room shifted around him. Audrey kept her breathing even as he crossed the polished floor, closer, then close enough that she could see the faint crease near his mouth, the one that appeared whenever he was forcing himself to feel nothing. He passed her. Not by inches, but by choice. The pale blue ribbon at her wrist stirred in the draft of his movement. Grant stopped before Helena Voss, bowed, and offered his hand. A silence passed through the ballroom, delicate and deadly. Then Helena placed her fingers in his, and the first waltz began. Audrey heard the whispers rise before the music covered them. Poor Miss Ellison. She must have misunderstood. No, my dear, she understood perfectly. Her family has so little left, perhaps she mistook politeness for intention. Audrey did not lower her eyes. She did not tear the ribbon from her wrist. She did not give the room the satisfaction of watching her shatter. Instead, she folded her gloved hands over the empty dance card and stood beneath the chandeliers as if nothing in the world had changed, while Grant Caldwell turned another woman through the candlelight, and every step of the waltz taught Audrey that a heart could break quietly, elegantly, and still be expected to applaud. Grant Caldwell did not look back at Audrey Ellison until the waltz was nearly over, and by then he had already told himself enough lies to survive the length of the song. He told himself that one dance was nothing. He told himself that Cape Wren society understood the language of alliances better than the language of feeling. He told himself that Miss Helena Voss was not a woman he desired, but a bridge to the banking house that could secure Belmont Harbor before the spring shipping season. He told himself that Audrey, with her quiet eyes and mended ivory gown, would understand without being told, because she understood too much already. Yet each turn across the polished floor brought him within sight of the eastern staircase, and each time he saw her standing there, still as a figure painted in candlelight, the lie grew heavier in his chest. Helena spoke pleasantly about her father's new warehouses, about the proposed railway spur that might one day run 6 miles inland from the coast, about the advantages of joining old title with modern capital. Grant answered with the correct words in the correct places. His hand remained formal at the proper distance from her waist. His expression remained composed. Only his eyes betrayed him, moving again and again to the pale blue ribbon at Audrey's wrist. He remembered tying it there himself in the dim shelter of the St. Orla archway, remembered the rain falling beyond them in silver lines, remembered how Audrey had looked at the small gift as if it were not silk but kindness, and kindness had become so rare in her life that she barely trusted it. That memory should have turned him around. It should have made him stop the music, cross the floor, and offer the apology her dignity deserved. Instead, he completed the waltz. Duty was a cold master, but Grant had been raised to obey it. His father had died with ledgers open on his desk and creditors waiting in rooms perfumed with false sympathy. Silverpine Hall was beautiful, but beauty did not pay harbor fees, rebuild damaged docks, or keep 300 families employed when winter closed the sea. The Voss money could save what remained of Belmont power. Audrey Ellison could save nothing, except perhaps the part of him he had spent years training himself to ignore. When the music ended, applause rose like a soft curtain between what had happened and what everyone would pretend had happened. Helena gave him a satisfied smile and lowered into a graceful curtsy. Grant bowed, but his gaze moved past her shoulder. Audrey was no longer beneath the staircase. For one brief moment, panic moved through him so sharply that he nearly stepped away without dismissing Helena properly. Then he saw Audrey near the tall windows overlooking the black Atlantic, her face turned toward the glass, her gloved fingers resting against the folded dance card. The candlelight behind her made her reflection faint and ghostly. She looked like a woman already practicing how to disappear. Grant started toward her. He made it only 3 steps before Mr. Voss intercepted him, broad, polished, and smiling with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what desperate nobility cost. "Your Grace," he said, offering his hand, "my daughter tells me you dance as admirably as you negotiate." Grant accepted the compliment with a bow of the head. Across the room, Audrey turned slightly, and for half a second their eyes met. There was no accusation in her expression. That was what struck him hardest. Accusation would have allowed him defense. Anger would have allowed him pride. But Audrey only looked at him with a calm sadness so complete that it seemed to have passed beyond pain into understanding. She understood that he had seen her. She understood that he had chosen not to come. Then Mrs. Ellison appeared beside her daughter, pale and fragile in a dark blue shawl, and Audrey immediately softened, bending her head to hear whatever her mother whispered. Even wounded, she gave comfort before seeking it. Grant watched her place one steadying hand over her mother's, and something inside him tightened with such force that he forgot Mr. Voss was still speaking. He had known ambitious women, charming women, dazzling women who could command a room with a glance. Audrey commanded nothing. She simply endured, and in that endurance there was a grace no fortune could purchase. "Your Grace?" Mr. Voss said. Grant looked back, the mask returning to his face. "Forgive me. You were speaking of the harbor loan. Of the future," Mr. Voss corrected smoothly. "A man in your position must be careful where he places his attention." The words were mild, but the warning beneath them was clear. Grant felt it settle over him like another layer of winter. When he turned toward the windows again, Audrey was gone. Not dramatically. Not with tears. She had simply stepped out of the room, leaving behind only an empty place by the glass and a pale blue ribbon burned into his memory like a question he had been too cowardly to answer. By the following Thursday, the story had learned to walk without Audrey's permission. It moved through Cape Wren in lace gloves and polished shoes, slipping from tea tables to carriage steps, from dressmakers' mirrors to the quiet corners of St. Orla's assembly room. No one said plainly that Grant Caldwell had humiliated Miss Ellison. Society rarely used honest words when cruel ones could be made elegant. They said only that the Duke of Belmont had been wise. They said Miss Helena Voss was a suitable companion for a man with harbors to secure, and a name old enough to require rescue. They said Audrey had looked remarkably composed, which in their language meant disappointed enough to entertain them but not important enough to defend. Audrey heard all of it. She heard it while choosing ribbon for her mother's winter bonnet at Mrs. Bellamy's shop. She heard it while walking the 3 blocks from the apothecary with a bottle of tonic wrapped in brown paper. She heard it from 2 young ladies outside the post office who lowered their voices only after realizing she had passed close enough to understand every word. "Poor thing," one whispered. "She wore his color, too." Audrey kept walking. The wind off the Atlantic pressed cold fingers beneath the collar of her wool coat, and the streets shone with a thin crust of old snow. Cape Wren looked beautiful in winter if one did not need to pay for coal. The white church steeple rose against the pewter sky, gulls circled above the harbor, and the Caldwell warehouses stood in a stern line along the wharf, proof that some families could weather any storm because the storms themselves seemed to belong to them. Ellison House, by contrast, sat 2 miles north of town among wind-bent pines, its clapboard walls in need of paint, its front gate leaning slightly from the last gale. Audrey returned there each afternoon to accounts she could not balance, and a mother who pretended not to cough until her daughter left the room. Mrs. Ellison never mentioned the waltz. That mercy was somehow worse. On Friday evening, an invitation arrived for the Harrowmere Conservatory ball, sealed in green wax and addressed in a hand so fine it seemed to mock the cracked tray on which the footman placed it. Audrey read it once, then set it beside the lamp. "You should go," her mother said from her chair near the fire. "People forget quickly when given something new to discuss." Audrey looked at the small flames struggling over damp wood. "They do not forget. They only grow bored." Yet she went, because the Ellison name still needed visibility, because absence in society could become a confession, and because some stubborn part of her refused to let one man drive her from rooms she had entered with dignity. Harrowmere Conservatory was all glass and iron, its winter gardens glowing with lanterns hung among orange trees kept alive by expensive heat. Audrey wore pale gray this time. No blue ribbon. No foolish token. She arrived with her mother on her arm and felt the room notice her like a hand touching a bruise. Grant was already there. He stood beside a marble fountain, speaking with Helena Voss and 2 men from her father's banking circle. When Audrey entered, his expression changed so slightly that no one else would have seen it. But she did. His shoulders stilled. His eyes moved to her bare wrist. For the briefest moment, something like regret crossed his face. Then Helena touched his sleeve and lifted a white camellia from the arrangement beside them. "Your Grace," she said brightly, "you promised to choose the first flower for the charity auction." Grant looked at Audrey. The entire conservatory seemed to hold its breath. He could have chosen any bloom. A rose. A lily. A simple sprig of pine. Instead, after a hesitation no longer than the wingbeat of a moth, he took the white camellia from Helena's fingers and handed it back to her with a formal bow. Applause fluttered through the room. Helena laughed softly, pleased and victorious. Audrey felt the old wound open with new precision, not larger, only deeper. The young ladies near the fern alcove exchanged delighted glances. Someone whispered, "Again." Audrey did not move. She even smiled when Mrs. Harrow praised her gown. She spoke kindly to an elderly judge. She helped her mother find a chair near the orchids. All the while, Grant watched her from across the heated garden as if he were the one trapped behind glass. When the dancing began, Audrey's card remained almost empty. Men who once would have asked out of courtesy now feared offending the woman everyone believed Grant intended to favor. That was the quietest cruelty of all. He did not claim Audrey, but his rejection marked her. Near midnight, as snow began tapping against the conservatory roof, Audrey stood beside a potted orange tree and understood with terrible clarity that every ball from now on would become a small funeral, not for her reputation alone, but for the hope she had been foolish enough to keep alive. The autumn hunt ball at Silverpine Hall was announced with such elegance that no one could have guessed how carefully it had been arranged to wound. Invitations went out on thick cream paper edged in copper, promising music, supper, and a late lantern walk through the frost gardens for those willing to brave the October air. By then, Audrey Ellison had endured 3 weeks of small public disappearances. At Harrowmere, Grant had given Helena Voss the first flower. At Marble Quay House, he had seated Lady Celine Frost beside him at dinner, while Audrey found her place near a retired colonel who spoke only of weather. At St. Orla's Assembly Room, he had crossed within 6 feet of her, close enough for her to notice the faint scent of cedar on his coat, and had not paused. Each occasion took so little from him that society called it nothing. Each occasion took something from Audrey that she could not name aloud. Still, when the Silverpine invitation arrived, she accepted. Her mother's health had improved for a few fragile days, and Mrs. Ellison insisted that retreat would only feed the gossip. "Go with your head high," she said, smoothing the sleeve of Audrey's dark green gown. "A woman may lose many things in this world, but not the manner in which she carries herself." So Audrey went. Silverpine Hall blazed against the night, its windows bright above the black Atlantic, its long drive crowded with carriages and lamps. Inside, the great hall smelled of pine garlands, beeswax, and rain-soaked wool. Hunting portraits watched from paneled walls. A fire large enough to warm a chapel roared beneath the carved mantel, throwing gold across polished boots and jeweled throats. Audrey entered quietly, without the blue ribbon, without expectation, and felt Grant's gaze find her before any greeting could be spoken. He stood near the hearth, speaking with Mr. Voss, his face composed in the hard, handsome way that had begun to feel less like restraint and more like refusal. For one moment, his attention rested on Audrey as though the room had narrowed to the space between them. Then Helena appeared at his side, radiant in amber silk, and the moment closed. Audrey moved toward the side table where the dance cards lay, though she no longer expected hers to matter. Near the stone staircase, 3 young ladies drifted close with the graceful aimlessness of people who had chosen a target. Helena came with them, smiling as if kindness had merely taken a sharper shape. "Miss Ellison," she said, "how brave of you to join us again." Audrey inclined her head. "How kind of you to notice." A tiny silence followed. One of Helena's companions hid a laugh behind her fan. Helena's eyes lowered to Audrey's empty wrist. "No blue tonight? I confess I admired that ribbon." "It was touching." "It was only silk," Audrey replied. "Of course." Helena's smile grew softer, and therefore worse. "Still, some women do treasure small tokens when larger promises are unavailable." The words landed quietly. "No one outside their circle would call them cruel. That was the skill of them." Audrey felt heat rise beneath her skin, but her voice remained even. "Then perhaps those women are fortunate. Small tokens are easier to return." A second companion gasped with pleasure at the exchange. Helena stepped half an inch closer. "Tell me, Miss Ellison, do you plan to wait by the staircase this evening as well, or has His Grace already selected your replacement?" The laughter was delicate, almost musical. It moved through Audrey like cold water. Across the hall, Grant heard it. She knew because his conversation stopped. She turned her eyes toward him, not pleading, not accusing, simply allowing him the full knowledge of the moment. He was close enough to come. Close enough to end it with one sentence. Close enough to prove that whatever he was doing in public did not require letting her be diminished in his own house. Grant shifted forward. Audrey saw the movement. Then Mr. Voss leaned toward him and spoke in a low voice. The harbor notes were due before Thanksgiving. The eastern dock repairs depended on signatures not yet secured. Belmont Pride stood on paper thinner than any dance card. Grant's jaw tightened. His hand closed around the stem of his wineglass, though he did not drink. 1 second passed. Then another. He did not come. Something in Audrey grew very still. It was not breaking this time. Breaking was loud inside the body, full of pain and disbelief. This was quieter. This was a door closing. She looked back at Helena and smiled with such calm that the other woman's expression faltered. "Enjoy your evening," Audrey said. Then she turned and walked away before they could see what their words had cost. She crossed the hall, passed beneath the carved balcony, and entered the shadowed corridor leading toward the portrait gallery. Only there, where the music softened behind thick walls and the ocean wind pressed against the windows, did she stop. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. Her breathing was steady too. Behind her, the ball continued bright and merciless. Ahead of her, the dark glass reflected a woman in green silk who had waited too long for a man to become brave. Audrey looked at that reflection and understood at last that she had mistaken endurance for hope. Grant Caldwell had not failed to see her pain. He had seen it clearly. He had simply decided that saving her was less convenient than keeping his place in the room. And from that moment she knew she would never stand beneath his chandeliers waiting to be chosen again. The morning after the Hunt Ball, Audrey Ellison woke before dawn to the sound of rain tapping against the sloped roof of Ellison House. For several minutes she did not move. The room was cold enough that her breath made a faint mist above the quilt, and the pale gray light at the window turned the familiar furniture into shadows: the narrow writing desk, the washstand with its cracked porcelain basin, the old wardrobe that still smelled faintly of lavender from better years. Somewhere below, her mother coughed once, then quieted herself as if even illness should be polite. Audrey turned her face toward the ceiling and felt no tears. That frightened her more than grief would have. Grief had motion. Grief wanted something returned. What filled her now was stillness, and in that stillness, the image of Grant Caldwell remained painfully clear, his hand tightening around the wineglass, his body leaning 1 inch forward, his eyes knowing exactly what was being done to her, and his feet remaining where they were. By breakfast, the rain had become a steady silver curtain over the pines. Mrs. Ellison sat near the parlor fire with a shawl across her knees, pretending to read yesterday's newspaper while watching Audrey over the edge of the page. "You left early last night," she said at last. Audrey poured tea into a chipped cup. The room was too warm. Her mother's gaze softened with the sorrow of a woman who had once been young enough to recognize such lies. "Rooms are seldom the true cause of leaving." Audrey set the teapot down carefully. "No." Silence gathered between them, not empty, but full of all that a mother wished to ask and a daughter wished to spare her. Mrs. Ellison reached for the cream, but her hand trembled. Audrey crossed the room at once, steadied it, and in that small domestic act remembered the shape of her real life. Not chandeliers. Not waltzes. Not a duke whose courage depended on who was watching. Her life was this house with its leaking west window, this mother with her brave smile, these accounts waiting in the desk drawer, these tenants who still bowed to her in town because the Ellisons, though poor, had never treated poverty as shameful. Near noon, a footman arrived from Silverpine Hall carrying a white envelope sealed in silver wax. He stood awkwardly beneath the porch roof while rain dripped from his hat brim. Audrey knew the seal before he offered it. Belmont. Her fingers remained dry and steady as she accepted the invitation. "No reply is required today, miss," the footman said. "His Grace's secretary said responses may be sent by the end of the week." "Thank you." She closed the door before breaking the seal. The invitation was exquisite, printed in dark blue ink on paper thick enough to feel like arrogance. The Belmont Winter Ball, to be held in 3 weeks, would mark the close of the coastal season. There would be music, supper, and dancing until midnight. At the bottom of the guest list, beneath names that glittered with money and title, was hers. Miss Audrey Ellison. Not forgotten. Merely placed low enough to remind her of the favor. Mrs. Ellison watched from the fire. "Is it from Silverpine?" Audrey nodded. "The winter ball. You should consider going." The words cost her mother something. Audrey heard it. "For our name? For your own future?" Audrey looked at the envelope, then toward the window where the Atlantic wind bent the pines until they bowed and rose again. What future is preserved by letting others teach me how little I am worth? Mrs. Ellison folded the newspaper in her lap. Audrey! I thought if I stood still enough, kind enough, proud enough, then dignity would protect me. Her voice remained soft, but something beneath it had changed. It does not. Dignity is not a shield if I keep carrying it into rooms where people are invited to strike it. Her mother closed her eyes briefly, as if the truth pained her because it could not be argued with. Audrey carried the invitation to her desk. She took out a sheet of plain paper, not the fine stationery saved for important calls, but ordinary white paper from the household drawer. She dipped her pen in ink. For a moment, she saw again the great ballroom, the staircase, Helena's smile, Grant's unmoving figure beneath his own roof. Then she wrote one sentence in a clear, graceful hand. Miss Audrey Ellison regrets that she will not attend. She sanded the ink, folded the note, and sealed it without hesitation. No accusation. No explanation. No wound displayed for society to admire. When the Belmont footman carried her answer back through the rain, Audrey stood at the parlor window and watched him disappear down the road toward Cape Wren. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest warmth inside her chest. It was not happiness. Not yet. It was smaller and stronger. It was the first quiet breath of a woman who had stopped waiting to be chosen and had chosen, at last, not to appear. The night of the Belmont Winter Ball arrived with a hard frost that silvered every pine needle along the road to Silverpine Hall. Carriages climbed the cliff road in a glittering procession, wheels crunching over frozen gravel, lanterns swaying like captured stars in the dark. Above them, the mansion blazed with light from every window, its white-gray stones shining against the black Atlantic as if the house itself refused to acknowledge winter. Inside, servants moved with silent precision beneath garlands of cedar and holly. Fires roared in every hearth. The ballroom had been transformed into a kingdom of candlelight, with evergreen bows framing the mirrors and hundreds of glass ornaments catching the glow until the walls seemed alive with small, trembling suns. Grant Caldwell stood at the head of the grand staircase in formal black, one hand resting near the silver chain of his pocket watch, his face arranged into the calm severity Cape Wren expected from the Duke of Belmont. He greeted families whose fortunes could strengthen his harbor, bowed to widows who remembered his father, and accepted compliments from men who measured friendship in signatures. Helena Voss arrived just after 8 o'clock in a gown of pale gold, her diamonds flashing at her throat like frost touched by fire. Her father followed, broad and satisfied, already speaking of contracts as though the evening were merely a ballroom wrapped around a bank table. Grant answered every greeting correctly. He smiled when custom required it. He offered Helena his arm when the room began to watch. Yet every few minutes, his eyes moved to the eastern staircase. Empty. He looked toward the tall windows overlooking the sea, where Audrey had once stood with her dance card folded beneath trembling fingers. Empty. He looked to the quiet space beside the marble column near the musicians, where she had waited through one cruel waltz after another with a dignity that had shamed him even before he was brave enough to admit it. Empty. At first, he told himself she was late. The northern road from Ellison House was narrow, and frost often slowed the horses near the bend above Wren Creek. Then the first dance began, and she was not there. The second dance passed. Still nothing. Supper was announced, silver covers lifted, champagne poured, laughter rising beneath the chandeliers with practiced ease. Audrey did not come. Her absence was not dramatic. No door opened to reveal it. No messenger crossed the floor to explain it. It simply occupied the room more completely than her presence ever had. Grant felt it at the edge of every conversation, in the pause before each answer, in the strange hollowness of music that should have pleased him. Helena noticed before he wanted her to. "You seem distracted, Your Grace," she said as they stood near the supper table, her gloved hand resting lightly on her fan. "Am I? Only when you look at the staircase." Her smile remained perfect, but her eyes were sharp. "Perhaps you are waiting for someone." Grant turned his glass once between his fingers. "I am waiting for no one." Helena glanced toward the eastern end of the ballroom. Then no one has disappointed you quite thoroughly. The words were quiet enough not to travel, but they struck with uncomfortable accuracy. Grant set the untouched glass down. Across the room, Mr. Voss was speaking to the harbor commissioner, his laughter heavy with ownership. A month ago, Grant would have found the sound reassuring. Tonight, it seemed to belong to a bargain whose price he had misunderstood. He excused himself and crossed the ballroom without knowing where he meant to go. Near the windows, the Atlantic rolled black beneath the moon, waves breaking against the cliffs nearly 200 feet below. The glass reflected the room behind him, Helena's gold gown, the moving dancers, the candles, the polished faces, all the things he had chosen because they were useful. But in the reflection, the space where Audrey should have been remained bare. He remembered her last look at the hunt ball, the calmness that had not forgiven him, the terrible stillness of a woman finally closing a door. Only now did he understand that she had not withdrawn to make him follow. She had withdrawn because she had learned he might not. "Your Grace?" his secretary murmured from behind him, appearing with a folded note on a silver tray. "This arrived with Miss Ellison's regrets earlier in the week." "You did not ask to see it." Grant turned slowly. The paper was plain. The seal was modest. He opened it beneath the candlelight and read the single sentence. "Miss Audrey Ellison regrets that she will not attend." No explanation. No plea. Not even enough anger to give him a place in her decision. Grant stared at the words until the music blurred at the edges. For months, he had treated Audrey's presence as something that would endure his hesitation, his cowardice, his public compromises. He had believed, with the arrogance of a man always obeyed, that she would remain somewhere in the room, wounded perhaps, but waiting. Now the room glittered without her, and all its gold seemed suddenly cheap. Behind him, the orchestra began another waltz. Helena waited near the center of the floor, poised to be chosen. Grant folded Audrey's note and placed it inside his coat, close to the heart he had used duty to silence. Then he looked once more at the empty staircase and understood, too late for that evening and perhaps too late for anything, that absence could speak more clearly than love ever had. For 3 days after the Belmont Winter Ball, Audrey Ellison's name was spoken more often in Cape Wren than it had ever been when she was present. Some called her absence pride. Others called it strategy. A few, kinder or perhaps merely more perceptive, called it dignity. Audrey did not hear most of it. She was too busy repairing the life everyone assumed had ended at the edge of a ballroom. At Ellison House, winter came through every weakness. Wind moved beneath the front door. Frost gathered inside the corners of the window panes. The roof above the kitchen leaked whenever the snows softened into rain. Yet Audrey rose each morning before 7 o'clock, lit the parlor fire herself to save the maid a trip from the village, and opened the account books at the little walnut desk by the east window. Her father had left behind more confusion than fortune, boundary disputes with neighboring farms, unpaid timber rights, old tenant agreements written in language no one had reviewed for nearly 20 years. Audrey studied them line by line until ink smudged her fingertips and candle smoke stung her eyes. Grief had once made the house feel abandoned. Work made it breathe again. On the 4th morning, Mr. Owen Hartley arrived from the law office in town, carrying a leather satchel and wearing a dark wool coat dusted with snow. He was not titled, not dazzling, and not the sort of man who made servants rush to announce him. He was simply steady. His family had kept a modest practice above the Cape Wren post office for 2 generations, and though society considered him useful rather than important, Audrey noticed at once that he entered a room without expecting anyone to shrink. "Miss Ellison," he said, removing his hat in the parlor, "your father once asked my uncle to review the northern timber lease. I found the notes last week. I believe there may be money owed to your estate." Audrey looked up from the desk, surprise breaking through her composure. "Owed to us?" "For 12 years, if the records are accurate." He placed the papers before her, not too close, not with the flourish of a savior, but with the care of a man offering a tool. "It will require patience. And several letters. Possibly a hearing in Portland if the company refuses settlement." Portland was nearly 60 miles away, farther than Audrey had traveled in years. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it opened something. "Then we shall be patient," she said. Owen smiled, not warmly enough to presume, but kindly enough to be remembered. He came twice that week, then again the next, always during daylight, always announced, always with papers, maps, or practical questions. He listened when Audrey spoke. That alone felt unfamiliar. Men in ballrooms had looked past her, around her, or through her to the advantages she did not possess. Owen looked at the columns of figures she had copied, at the tenant names she remembered, at the careful notes she made in the margins, and treated her mind as if it belonged in the room. By late January, the unused glass house behind Ellison House had become her second project. Its panes were cracked, its benches warped, and dead vines clung to the iron ribs like old sorrow. Audrey hired 2 village boys for a few cents an afternoon to clear the debris, then opened the space on Saturdays for the children of tenant families who could not easily reach the school in town during snow. She taught letters beside empty planting beds. She warmed bricks by the kitchen stove and wrapped them in cloth for the smallest children's feet. Mrs. Ellison, watching from the window, said Audrey looked more alive among broken glass and chalk dust than she ever had beneath chandeliers. News traveled, as news always did. By the time Grant Caldwell heard of it, the story had grown edges. Miss Ellison had taken a lawyer into her confidence. Miss Ellison was recovering money from a timber company. Miss Ellison had opened a school in her old glass house. Miss Ellison had been seen laughing with Mr. Hartley outside the post office while snow fell on both their shoulders. Grant heard the last detail from his secretary and dismissed him too sharply. For a long moment afterward, he stood alone in the Silverpine library, staring at the winter sea beyond the windows. Laughing. He tried to imagine it, and found that he could, which wounded him more deeply. Audrey's laugh was quiet, rare, the kind that appeared only when she forgot to guard herself. He had heard it once beneath the St. Orla archway before he taught her caution. Now another man had heard it in daylight, without shame, without hiding. Grant placed his hand inside his coat and touched the folded note she had sent. The paper had begun to soften at the creases from being opened too often. He had thought jealousy would feel like anger at Owen Hartley. It did not. It felt like standing outside a warm house whose door he himself had closed. For the first time, Grant understood that Audrey had not vanished into sorrow. She had stepped into a life where he was no longer the center of the wound. And that, more than any accusation she could have spoken, made him feel the full poverty of his power. By the first week of March, Cape Wren had begun to thaw at the edges. Snow still lay in the shadows beneath the pines, and the Atlantic remained cold and iron dark, but the roads softened by noon, and a pale light lingered longer over the harbor. Audrey Ellison noticed these changes more than she once would have. The world seemed less like a stage for judgment now and more like a place that could be repaired, one pane of glass, one ledger line, one small act of courage at a time. The timber dispute had not yet ended, but Mr. Owen Hartley had secured a formal acknowledgment from the company that money might indeed be owed to the Ellison estate. That single word, might, carried enough hope to warm the whole parlor. The glasshouse school had grown from 6 children to 14, with slates stacked beside seed trays and a little iron stove smoking bravely in the corner. Audrey spent her mornings teaching letters, her afternoons reviewing estate papers, and her evenings reading aloud to her mother by the fire. She was tired often, but it was a clean tiredness. It belonged to labor, not humiliation. Then, on the second Friday of March, an invitation arrived from Marble Quay House. The final assembly of the coastal season would be held there before the great families withdrew to their spring estates. Audrey held the card in her hand for a long time, feeling the old world call to her in engraved script. Mrs. Ellison looked up from her embroidery. "You do not have to go." Audrey smiled faintly. "No." She turned the invitation once between her fingers. "That is precisely why I think I can." She chose a gown of blue silver silk that had belonged to an aunt in Boston, and had been packed away for years in cedar. It was not fashionable in the newest sense, but it moved beautifully, catching light like moonlit water. She wore no ribbon on her wrist. No borrowed symbol. No secret plea. Her hair was pinned simply with 2 pearl combs that had survived every sale because her mother could never bear to part with them. When she descended the stairs, Mrs. Ellison pressed a hand to her mouth, not from sorrow this time, but from pride. "You look like yourself," she whispered. Audrey kissed her cheek. At last! Marble Quay House stood near the harbor, built of pale stone with a terrace facing the water and tall arched windows that glowed amber against the early spring fog. When Audrey arrived, the ballroom was already bright with music and conversation. For a moment, standing at the threshold, she remembered too much: the heat of whispers, the empty dance cards, Grant passing her as if she were a shadow he had once admired and could no longer afford. Her fingers tightened around her fan. Then Owen Hartley, who had escorted her and her mother as a courtesy, spoke quietly beside her. "Shall we?" Not "Are you afraid?" Not "Everyone is watching." Only "Shall we?" as though entering a room were a simple matter, and she had every right to do it. Audrey stepped forward. The footman announced her name, and the effect was immediate. Conversations thinned, then faltered. Heads turned across the polished floor. Women who had once smiled at her misfortune now studied her gown, her bare wrist, the composed lift of her chin. Men who had neglected her dance card looked suddenly uncertain, as if remembering a debt no ledger recorded. Audrey did not glow with triumph. That would have been too easy. She simply walked into the room without asking it to welcome her, and somehow that made the room yield. Grant Caldwell saw her from beside the western archway. He had been speaking to Helena Voss, though his attention had wandered long before Audrey entered. When her name crossed the ballroom, he turned with such sudden stillness that Helena stopped mid-sentence. Audrey was not looking at him. That struck first. Not the gown, though the blue-silver silk seemed made from evening tide. Not the pearls, not the calm, not even the absence of the ribbon. It was the fact that her eyes moved across the room as if he were only one object among many, no longer the sun by which her pain arranged itself. Grant felt the breath leave him slowly. Helena followed his gaze, and something hardened in her face. "She has returned," she said. "Yes," Grant answered, unable to make his voice indifferent. "And not alone." Owen Hartley stood near Audrey with easy respect, neither claiming her nor abandoning her, and Grant understood the quiet power of such restraint because he had failed at it so completely. The orchestra began tuning for the first waltz. Around the room, expectation gathered, bright and hungry. Audrey accepted greetings with grace. She smiled at an elderly judge, thanked Mrs. Harrow for asking after her mother, and allowed Owen to lead her toward the edge of the floor. Then, for the first time that evening, she looked at Grant. There was no tremor in her face. No invitation. No wound displayed. Only recognition, calm as the sea after a storm has spent itself. Grant lowered his eyes to her wrist. Bare. The small absence struck harder than any jewel could have. The ribbon he had given her was gone, and with it the woman who had once waited beneath his chandeliers hoping he would become worthy of his own tenderness. In that crowded ballroom, with every candle burning and every whisper poised to awaken, Audrey Ellison had returned not to be chosen, but to prove she had survived being unchosen. And the silence that followed her arrival was the first honest applause society had ever given her. The first waltz at Marble Quay House began with a single clear note from the violin, delicate as frost breaking under morning sun. Around the ballroom, couples shifted into place, silk skirts whispering over polished wood, gloved hands lifting with practiced grace. Audrey Ellison stood near the edge of the floor with Owen Hartley beside her, calm enough to hear the sea beyond the terrace doors and the low murmur of people pretending not to watch. She knew what they wanted. They wanted a scene, a punishment, a triumph sharp enough to repeat over breakfast. They wanted her to turn away from Grant Caldwell with theatrical pride, or accept him with foolish softness, so they could name her either cold or weak and feel satisfied. Audrey gave them either. Grant crossed the floor before the first measure settled into rhythm. Helena Voss stood waiting only a few yards away, one hand extended slightly, already prepared for the invitation the room assumed would be hers. Mr. Voss watched from near the fireplace, his expression tightening as Grant passed his daughter without pausing. A ripple moved through the guests, small but unmistakable. Grant did not look left or right. His eyes remained on Audrey, not with the old controlled distance that had once wounded her, but with a humility so visible it made even the cruelest whispers falter. He stopped before her and bowed. Not the shallow courtesy a duke offered to a lady of lesser fortune. A real bow. Low enough to make the room understand that whatever pride had stood between them had bent first. "Miss Ellison," he said, his voice steady, though Audrey heard the strain beneath it. "May I have this dance?" Owen did not move until Audrey looked at him. Then he inclined his head gently, with no claim, no resentment, only respect. "The choice is yours," he said. That simple sentence traveled through Audrey more deeply than the music. The choice is yours. Once she would have searched Grant's face for permission to hope. Once she would have mistaken his outstretched hand for rescue. Now she looked at it and saw it for what it was, an apology offered too late to erase pain, but perhaps not too late to begin truth. She lifted her eyes to his. "Your Grace," she said softly, "are you asking because you have chosen me, or because you have learned that I may choose another?" The question moved through the ballroom like a candle flame bending in sudden wind. Grant's face changed. No offense. No wounded pride. Only the quiet impact of deserved words. He glanced once toward Helena, then toward Mr. Voss, then back to Audrey. "Both," he said. The honesty struck harder than any polished speech could have. "And I am ashamed that it required your absence to teach me what your presence should have made plain." Audrey's fingers tightened around her fan. Grant continued, his voice low but clear enough for those nearest them to hear. "I allowed duty to become cowardice. I allowed convenience to wear the mask of honor. I saw you hurt in rooms where my name had power, and I did not use that power kindly. There is no explanation that can make that noble." The silence deepened. Helena's cheeks had gone pale, but Audrey did not look at her. This moment did not belong to Helena, or to the watching women with their jeweled throats and eager eyes. It belonged to the girl who had stood beneath chandeliers with a breaking heart, and no witness brave enough to defend her. Audrey looked at Grant's extended hand. Then she placed her gloved fingers lightly over his. Not as surrender. Not as forgiveness fully granted. As an answer measured in dignity. The waltz opened around them. Grant led carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid that one wrong step might prove he had learned nothing. Audrey moved with him beneath the amber lights, her blue-silver gown catching the glow like moonlight on Cape Wren water. For the first time, society saw what it had mocked too casually, not a desperate young woman waiting for favor, but a woman of quiet courage who had endured humiliation without becoming cruel, who had lost admiration without losing herself. Grant felt the room watching, but his attention did not leave Audrey. "I cannot undo what I allowed," he said as they turned near the terrace doors. "No," Audrey replied. Her voice held no bitterness, which made the truth more complete. "You cannot? Then tell me what I may do." Audrey looked past his shoulder, where the Atlantic fog pressed softly against the glass. "Begin by never mistaking silence for consent. And never again call fear by the name of duty." Grant bowed his head slightly. "I will not." She believed, not that he had become perfect, but that he had finally become honest. It was a smaller miracle, and perhaps the only kind that lasts. In the weeks that followed, Cape Wren spoke of the dance until spring rain washed winter from the roads. The Voss alliance cooled, but Belmont Harbor did not fall. Grant found less costly financing in Portland, and for once accepted terms that did not require the sacrifice of his conscience. The timber settlement restored enough money to repair Ellison House, replace the cracked glasshouse panes, and keep the little school open through summer. Owen Hartley remained Audrey's trusted attorney and friend, respected by her all the more because he had never turned kindness into a debt. Grant came often to Ellison House, never unannounced, never empty of purpose, sometimes bringing books for the children, sometimes sitting with Mrs. Ellison while Audrey reviewed estate papers, sometimes saying very little because he was learning that presence, when humble, could heal what grand declarations could not. By autumn, when the pines along Cape Wren turned dark against the gold sky and Silverpine Hall prepared for another season of music, Audrey returned to its ballroom without dread. She wore no token on her wrist. She needed none. Grant asked for the first waltz before anyone else could enter the room, and this time, he asked in private first, so that her yes would belong to her before society could claim it. She gave it after a long look, a small smile, and the kind of peace that comes only after pain has been honored rather than denied. Some hearts learn too late, but not always too late to change. And some women are not lost when they leave the room, they are finally found by themselves, and only then can love approach them with clean hands.